Okay, and it started, Chair.
Na ni, bore da i chi gyd, a croeso i chi i'r cydbwyllgor rhanbarthol yma bore yma. Get goffa pawb sy'n bysar o bod y cyfarfod yn cael ei recordio, a dylech chi sicrhau bod eich meicroffonnau wedi diffodd, ond i bai bod chi'n siarad wrth gwrs, a hefyd sicrhau bod ffonau symudol wedi diffodd. Os ydych chi'n moyn siarad, codwch eich llaw electronig i ofyn cwestiwn. I ni wedi derbyn ymddeiriadau bore yma gan y cynghorydd Rob Stewart, a fi'n gweld bod Andrea yma fel dirprwy Abertawe ar ei rhannau, so croeso i ti, Andrea. I ni hefyd wedi derbyn ymddeiriadau wrtho Liz Bickerton, sef cynrychiolydd Parc Cenedlaethol Bannau Byrcheiniog, a hefyd wrth Wendy Walters, sef Prif Weithredwr Sir Gar, wrth gwrs. Felly, os ni'n hapus i dderbyn rhain, sef ymlaen i'r eitem nesaf, sef eitem 2, datganiadau fuddiannau personol. Gai ofyn i aelodau os yna unrhyw fuddiant i chi am ddatgan y bore yma. Byddwn ni ddim yn tybio. Felly, os ni'n hapus, newn ni symud mlaen te i eitem 3, sef cyfnodion y cyfarfod blaenorol. Mae'r eitem yma yn dechrau adran 3 o'r bore yma, ac yn gofnod o'r cyfarfod ac yn halwyd nôl ar y 10fed o Orffennaf. Maen nhw yma i'w cymeradwyo. Os yna unrhyw sylwadau ar y cywirdeb, os nag oes unrhyw gwestiynau, gai ofyn am gynigydd bod ni'n derbyn nhw'n ffurfiol.
Happy to propose, Chair. Happy to propose, Chair.
Thank you, John. A gai eilydd hefyd, please. A Steve yn hapus i eilio. Diolch, Steve. Thank you very much for that. So, a gai ofyn i bawb i ddangos trwy gwrdd i'r llawdau, os ydych chi'n hapus i derbyn yn ffurfiol. Diolch yn fawr. Dwi'n symud ymlaen awr te, eitem 4, sef adolygiad o'r cynllun economaidd rhanbarthol. Mae hyn yn dechrau ar dudalen 18 o'r pecyn, a gai ofyn gynta i Helen Morgan i gyflwyno'r adroddiad cyn bod ni'n dod a Ross Gill o SQW mewn ar ôl ni. So, Helen, draw i ti. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Cadeirydd, a diolch yn fawr. Jyst moyn cyflwyno'r adroddiad yn fyr. Rydyn wedi bod yn gwneud yr adolygiad hyn dros yr 8 mis diwetha. Mae'r grŵp sector preifat wedi cael rôl yn y gwaith hyn, a mae barn nhw wedi dod mewn i byth i'r adolygiad fel mae'n sefyll nawr. Felly, wneith Ross ddod mewn, gallai croesawu Ross Gill. Mae Ross yn mynd i roi cyflwyniad i ni ar yr adolygiad a gymerwn ni cwestiynau ar ôl ni. Ross, are you here? No.
Okay, Bore, good morning. Thanks very much for inviting me along. I'll just share my screen and then I'll run through some slides. Bear with me. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah, all good. Thanks very much, thanks. Well, as Helen said by way of introduction, I'm Ross Gill from SQW, and we've been working with colleagues across South West Wales over the past few months to prepare a review of the Regional Economic Delivery Plan. As you might recall, we produced the REDP back in 2021-22, so a few years ago. The REDP was adopted by the CJC back at the start of 2022, although most of the work to inform it had taken place over the preceding year. It's not that old, so it is only a few years since it was done, but quite a lot has changed in that time in terms of the policy context and so on. And partners thought that it was appropriate at this stage to produce a midterm review to see where we'd got to in terms of the ambitions and the missions that were set out at the time, and to consider whether there was a need to tweak, to update any of those priorities that we'd outlined in the previous REDP. I should say that the brief that we had wasn't to prepare a completely new regional economic delivery plan. It was very much about building on what had already been produced, giving an assessment of progress and looking to the future in terms of anything that needed to be changed. So we've tried as far as possible to keep the overall framework the same as we had before, because it seemed to have quite a lot of traction and seemed to be mostly extant. It's an updating job, not a complete refresh job. And there's quite a strong rationale to that, in the sense that when the REDP was originally adopted, it was cast as being essentially a 10-year plan, so looking to 2030 and just beyond. It kind of makes sense from a consistency point of view to say, well, it still is a 10-year plan. The broad ambitions that we set out at the time are still the right ones, but let's just see where we've got to in terms of progress. And hopefully this update will be helpful in demonstrating that the strategy is up to date, and hopefully that's a useful framework to engage with Welsh Government, UK Government, to use as background material in developing funding proposals and so on. We've had a look within the document at some of the opportunities that are emerging in the changing policy context. You'll notice that within the refresh, there is a section in there which talks in particular about the industrial strategy, which of course is relatively new. And potentially is an important basis for future government funding, especially from UK government. We've had a fresh look at the economy in terms of how that fits into the 8 priority industrial strategy sectors that UK government has set out. In some cases, there are some very specific regional strengths, especially in respect of clean energy, creative industries, advanced manufacturing in particular. There are some others where actually the regional presence is much smaller, as you might expect, financial services and so on. But there are some areas where there is sufficient overlap, either within the business base or within some of the academic capabilities of Swansea University, TSD and so on. In broad terms, some of these align with those economic strengths and opportunities we set out within the REDP, especially around energy infrastructure and low carbon potential, which was the big emphasis that we made within the REDP back in 2021-22. But nonetheless, we have continued to emphasise the importance of sectors to the region that are outside of the Industrial Strategy 8. So, okay, they are the sectors which UK government has adopted, but it doesn't say very much in there about, for example, agriculture and agri-tech. It does a bit, but not very much, but that's important to the region. It doesn't say anything about tourism and the visitor economy, which are very important to parts of the region too. So we've tried to strike that balance within the refresh between responding to some of those things which are very salient with national government, at the same time as reinforcing some of the local and regional strengths that we have here. We've set out within the document a review of where we are in terms of regional economic progress. A lot of economic indicators, as you'll be aware, change quite slowly, so you wouldn't necessarily expect to see major change in respect of some of these. There is an increase in productivity over time, still a significant gap with the UK overall. We would expect that change happens quite slowly. When we produced the REDP back in 2021, we were still in the context of the aftermath of the pandemic and the slowdown in jobs growth and still some uncertainty about how the recovery would play out. There's been a return to jobs growth since then, although as you can see on the right-hand side, the recovery hasn't really kept pace with that in the UK as a whole. And we do quote the figure within the report that if we increased economic activity rates up to the UK level, that would be about 21,000 people into the workforce, which is quite significant. And we've also emphasised some of those significant challenges in bringing forward some of the region's major sites, and I think that probably has additional salience now, more so than it did back in 2021 in the context of Tata Transition at Talbot, in the context of Freeport and so on as well. And that links into some of the opportunities and challenges associated with things like industrial decarbonisation. We talk a bit more in the revised report about the advance of artificial intelligence as well, which wasn't something that we talked about quite so much back in 2021-22. We've set out a refreshed strategic framework. Those of you that the original REDP will recognise this. We've tried deliberately not to change it radically. So the ambitions that we set out, the sort of broad, fairly generic ambitions really around resilient and sustainable, enterprising, ambitious, balanced and inclusive, they remain. The core of the original REDP was the 3 missions around establishing South West Wales as a UK leader in renewable energy and a net zero economy, building a strong, resilient and embedded business base, and growing and sustaining the experience offer. Our discussions as part of the refresh indicated quite a lot of support for those and good progress made against them, which I'll come on to in a moment. So they remain. We've, however, tried to adapt this slightly by incorporating some of these underpinning factors around employment and skills, sustainable connectivity and sites and premises, which I'll come on to. And I'll say a bit about the route to delivery in a moment. So that's the strategic framework we've set out in the REDP. I think overall the region's made good progress in delivering against those 3 missions that were outlined. In respect of renewable energy, we have the designation and the launch of the Celtic Freeport. We've got the work underway to bring forward some of those other big renewable energy schemes elsewhere in the region. The investment in infrastructure to support industrial decarbonisation. So there's a good story to tell, which we can tell at national scale really about the region's progress in respect of that. You might remember that in the original REDP there was a line in there that said something like, there is all this potential, but remember that people in other parts of the UK and internationally also have some potential and will be investing quite heavily. So there's an opportunity to be gained, but there's also an opportunity to be missed. I guess to some extent that's still true, but nonetheless, a lot of progress has been made, more than perhaps we might have anticipated back at the time. In terms of developing the business base, there's been good progress in delivering some infrastructure for business, especially around some of that innovation infrastructure, the major projects at Matrix and Kingsway in Swansea, Swansea Bay Technology Centre at Baglan, Pentrawl and Llanelli and so on. Through UK Shared Prosperity Fund, there's been a lot of focus on developing the business support offer. I think probably some aspects of what we call the kind of an integrated innovation approach that we envisaged in the original REDP hasn't quite come about, but nonetheless there are some good outputs emerging from the UK SPF projects, and there'll be an important discussion about how that gets sustained going forward. And there's been progress in delivering new commercial space, although we do emphasise quite strongly the viability gaps that still remain and the need for substantial grant funding to support that. The third mission that we set out was around growing and sustaining the regional experience offer. That includes the visitor economy, but we were very keen to emphasise that it's not just the visitor economy, it's about quality of life assets as well, and those things which by their own value support investment in the region and so on. Clearly a lot of work in bringing forward some of those key assets. So Swansea Arena opened since we wrote the REDP, as did the visitor attractor at Pendine. Other schemes underway, Havemore, Vale of Neath and so on, which have come on since as well. So there's a lot that's happened there. And through things like Levelling Up Fund and so on, quite a bit of investment that's gone into towns and city centres, although clearly the market pressures are quite adverse in relation to some of that. We then also set out 3 themes that support all of those missions. I think these are areas that were perhaps implicit in the original REDP, but not as explicit as they ought to be. And it's quite important that we bring them out more clearly, especially if we want to use the document as a basis for securing funding and so on. First, around employment and skills. In the context of technology change in particular, and with a stronger emphasis on that employment and economic activity gap that I highlighted earlier. Second, around sustainable connectivity. We didn't say an awful lot in the original REDP about transport investment, but nonetheless quite a lot has moved on in terms of the thinking around Swansea and South West Wales metro, and not just in terms of rail infrastructure itself, but the development opportunities that improved rail infrastructure can bring forward, especially in urban areas. And that very much reflects some of the feedback that we had from private sector advisory board as well. And then thirdly, as I've said before, around sites and premises, both linked with on-site constraints, if you like, but also the wider nationally significant pressures on grid infrastructure and so on. We then talk finally at the end about what we've called routes to investment and delivery. The REDP refresh isn't supposed to be a delivery plan, so it doesn't get into details of projects that will come forward and so on. It's a refresh of the quite high level strategy that we had before. We do talk in there, though, about starting to make the case for greater flexibility in terms of investment funding. And part of this, I guess, is with an eye to what's happened in Cardiff Capital Region and the wider investment fund that they've had, the way in which they've been able to deploy that quite flexibly, and how do we make the case for that sort of thing in South West Wales. Linked with that, the case for future investment at scale, and I guess some of that very much goes down to the sites and premises piece and bringing forward some of those strategic sites which will rely on significant public sector investment, conscious of the UK government's strategic sites fund, which was announced a while ago, and other potential routes to support from that, and how do we use this to make a case through that. We've done a bit of work in setting out a starting point for a monitoring framework, which is in the document, and the intention there is to try and link some of the different mechanisms of monitoring that we have across the region together so that we can tell a consistent story. And some of the progress that's been made in terms of UK Shared Prosperity Fund is quite important in that regard. And then finally, developing the project pipeline. When we produced the original REDP, there was a project pipeline supplement that ran to about sort of 46 different projects, many of which have come forward and have either been delivered or are being delivered, and that's reflected in some of the earlier narrative. We're in the process of refreshing that now, with the intention of making it a bit more strategically focused. That will never be complete because it's live, isn't it? And new projects come on stream, some prove not to be viable and move away and so on. But it's really a case of updating it and keeping it live so that when there are opportunities to bid for funding and so on, there are some project opportunities there to take forward. So I hope that's helpful as a bit of an introduction to the REDP refresh, and happy to take any questions or comments at this point.
Thanks, Ross. Yeah, much appreciated. So lots of work going on in this space. It's quite busy, isn't it? As you've summarised there. I suppose, yes, we can note the progress in lots of different fronts, as you mentioned. The work around the Freeport, the Natic House, Circular Economy Park here in terms of that first mission. But I suppose the concern that we keep coming back to very often is around financing and funding of future developments. And we've been lucky, haven't we? When you reference the Pentref and the Arena, that UK government investment in terms of city deal funding and levelling up has been massive for lots of us, isn't it, in terms of that experience economy that you referenced as well, and town centre development. And clearly we haven't quite got that clarity yet in terms of where we go in the medium term with funds to support that type of activity, which obviously is a concern for some of us, and it links into the point you made then in terms of the development of that sort of flexible investment fund, isn't it? So there's certainly a bit of thinking to be done there, I think, in the medium term in terms of how we tackle that. I've got a list of people here who want to ask questions, so we'll start off with John Harvey and Pembrokeshire. So.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Cadeirydd. Thank you, Darren, and thank you, Ross. Yeah, I think very good progress in respect of the three missions in the original report, if you like. I think good progress there. Celtic Freeport in this part of the world, obviously very exciting if that comes up. Likewise with Pembroke Dock Marine. But in terms of the underpinning fundamentals you mentioned, and specifically connectivity, now I think connectivity is absolutely vital, especially as you get further west. In this part of the world, we are a long way from anywhere really, but beautiful county nevertheless. Digital connectivity, absolutely important. How can we attract businesses into Pembrokeshire where we've got a good digital signal? As a county council, we've spent a lot of money and a lot of work in doing this, and that's improved greatly over the last few years. Rail connectivity, you mentioned, we're in discussions with GWR at the moment about extending the London Paddington services down to Milford Haven on a more frequent basis. But I think buses are important as well, and that's not necessarily referenced there, because how do you get from a very rural area, and I'm looking at Darren here in parts of Carmarthenshire as well, how do you get to your local train station? So I think bus infrastructure is also something we need to look at going forward. So just wanted to make that point on connectivity, really, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Steve, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Dar. Thanks for that, Ross. And I'm not going to repeat, I agree with what Darren has said, and John as well. I've just got Ross, excellent work, and I mean, we drive in the CJC, but you made reference quite a few times in that presentation to funding, shared prosperity, levelling up, where we know levelling up no longer exists. Shared prosperity is shrinking. I'm the economy spokesperson for the Independents, and only this last week, I had a meeting with Rebecca Evans, and the uncertainty of funding. I just wondered, when we're looking to deliver on our missions, and we know one way or another, the CJC is the tool that the Welsh Government and UK Government are looking to use going forward. But the uncertainty, the clarity, the information that we are not having, and I can say that from that meeting I had, we've asked for an urgent meeting with UK ministers so we can get that clarity for those who are already working in the shared prosperity as jobs, who need to know, are their jobs safe, are we going to deliver the project that is still there, and they all fit into the CJC. And I just wondered, for us to deliver, the Welsh Government obviously is going to be election, they go into Purda, and that was the question, isn't it? No decisions being made. So I just wondered, stagnating of the CJC, while officers doing excellent work, nothing is delivered without the funding sort of programme and bubble, knowing what you have it, so you know what you're able to use to deliver on. And even within the CJC is a lot of jobs, isn't there, as well. So it's just, I've got a major concern of where we go. And I don't, Darren knows this, I hate talking shops, and I'm not saying everybody on this call are excellent in the work they do, their experience, but I like outcomes. And you've demonstrated there, the delivery and the where we going is really good, but it's going to get even more frustrating, I'm sure, for the politicians, where Darren's spokesperson on transport and leads that. It's just I say it as it is, and I'm not trying to put a blame on anybody, but I just think bringing it all together and clarity and an understanding is so vitally important. I'm sure a lot share that view. So I just wanted to when we come to these missions and everything, we're all on board, but I just don't know how we're going to get to the end of the tunnel, sort of analogy. So, but thank you for the work you do, and everybody else. But the partnership is critical going forward, and making sure public funds we're using as well, that we maximise what we get to the benefit of all our sort of regions, constituencies, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Helen, do you want to moon?
Diolch, Cadeirydd. I just want to provide a bit of an update following an email we had from the WLGA late yesterday afternoon on future funding. There is a meeting this afternoon, a Pan Wales WLGA meeting for regeneration officers, where the Welsh Government and UK Government are going to be present, and they will give us a bit more information about future funding following SPF, and we know that it's going to be called the Local Growth Fund. Welsh Government are going to undertake a series of regional consultation events in October, to feed into the process. My understanding is that the 4 local authority leaders are meeting with the Welsh Government on Thursday as part of that consultation. There is talk of there being more capital available. There's indication that there are going to be more national projects. As you know, we've been working on a very local delivery, regional collaboration and kind of model over the last 3 years, which has worked very well. So at least now we know that both Welsh Government and the UK Government are beginning to unveil their sort of plans for post-March 26. And there's even talk of reconvening, for those of you who are involved with European funding, an EU programme monitoring committee. So that was a bit startling. So that's it. Leader, Councillor Price.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's something that we've been quite clear on, is that we've made representations to Welsh Government that actually we want to see that streamlined system in operation, and it's not about creating bureaucratic structures with any new funding framework. That's, I think, vital, that, you know, I think the more flexibility we have locally and regionally to utilise those funds, the better. But I accept that we're not the only voice in this discussion. Okay, so we will move on then. So Paul, do you want to come in?
Yes, Diolch yn fawr. Thanks for bringing me in on this. I just had a couple of quick points. I was interested to see the report and the summary of the progress that we've made. One of the things that the report pointed to, of course, was the graph that demonstrates that jobs is an issue in Wales in general, actually, but also in our region. And I suppose one of the things I'd be interested in is unpicking that a little bit further. We're very conscious that in our sector, we're seeing a very significant downturn in participation rates in some of the more skilled areas in higher education. We have seen an uplift in some of the levels 1 and 2 in further education, but much less so at the higher levels. So we have this increasing graduate gap, not just for our region, but for Wales as a whole. And I think it is important to be thinking through the implications that might have for the labour force going forward and what needs we may have at a slightly more granular level. So instead of total jobs, let's think a little bit more about how we break that down and where the needs might actually be. And the second point, and I strongly support the focus on the energy ideas. I think there's a lot that could be done in the region. Clearly, a lot of it is still developing, but I think there's real opportunity there. But we also ought to take into account some of the real strengths the region already has and just make sure that we don't miss some of those. And obviously, from my perspective, you know, the advanced manufacturing, the life sciences, some of those areas where we do have real strengths. I guess thinking as we think about future funding, making sure that we keep ourselves at least open to some of those opportunities, I think would be really wise.
Absolutely, thanks, thanks, Paul. Madeline.
Diolch, Cadeirydd. Diolch, Ross. Thank you for that. I'm coming to this new, so I've got the looking at the original as well as the review period, and I was really pleased to hear, Ross, you're picking up that the environmental quality and sense of place perhaps wasn't quite so strong either in mission 3 or throughout the document, and that's so important for us. And again, you highlighted the importance of tourism and agriculture as sectors. You know, clearly we're looking at where we can enhance and improve always. But it was just that point you would be surprised if I didn't mention. It would be really good and encouraging, I think, for people to see how our drive for economic development goes hand in hand with promoting and improving the environmental quality, because that is such a key part of the experience, but it's a key part of our natural resources. That's what we should be protecting and promoting as well. Diolch.
Diolch, Madeline. Yeah, so quite a few comments and questions there, Ross. I'm not sure if you want to come back to maybe respond to some of those.
I mean, I think they're all points that we recognise really. I suppose just to pick up on two of them. Firstly, that breaking down the issues in the labour market that Paul mentioned. I think that probably would be quite useful, and I'm sure we can perhaps share some of the data and so on that we've got as well, if that's helpful, and we can do that afterwards. But I do recognise that it's not just what we've presented in there is a bit of a snapshot, but actually thinking about what the implications are at different levels and so on is really important as well. And I suppose the other thing is just to kind of I'm not sure I can add very much to the points that Councillor Hunt made really around funding uncertainty and so on. It's really difficult, isn't it? Because we want to set out a strategy which is clear and has clear priorities and so on. But that is dependent on securing funding in an uncertain environment. And I guess part of the purpose of this is having something that is there so that when opportunities emerge, we can respond, or collectively can respond as quickly as we can to them, because the flip side of uncertainty is quite often very limited timescales and, you know, a lack of time to prepare for when things are launched. And, you know, we need to sort of prepare for that as well, don't we?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I say, it's a work in progress, but it's useful to have that snapshot, as you say, isn't it? It's important to take a bit of time out to see where we've got to and where we're going next. Lots of uncertainty, as I say, not just on the funding side, but you know, more recently we've seen the impact of the nitrate guidance issued by NRW, which is a very real challenge facing us all in this region in the short to medium term. And I know that we had a meeting last week with the ministers to try and unlock some of that stuff, because the reality is if we can't get planning applications through, we're not going to create anywhere near the jobs that we have in terms of our target. So there's that. But of course, there are opportunities around there. So we've discussed here the changes in terms of moving the Swansea Bay City Deal governance structure within the CJC structure. So there are opportunities in terms of how we work, certainly over the next few months going forward. Andrea, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Darren and Chair, and yeah, listening intently to all the comments, and like Madeline, seeing this through a fresh pair of eyes in a sense, having this been my first time on this committee representing Rob. You know, it is really, I think there's a big track record to be proud of here. You know, we've made extremely good progress, and looking at that across the region is very, very positive. But I just wanted to come in and support your comments around serious concerns around the nitrate issue. And we definitely need to get a quick resolution with that, because nothing will stymie progress more than that. And it's frightening when you look at the figures, the jobs that would be impacted, the lack of social housing and housing that will be developed that we know is needed, and schools and so on and so forth. It just goes on and on. The list is long. So, you know, for a number of years now, we've been pushing for vocational alongside academic subjects in terms of, you know, from your architects and engineers to your construction and trade skills. And this pipeline was the hope that we would have future jobs for our young people. And the nitrates put that at risk. So I just wanted to come in really and support your comments on that, and you know, echo that we have some very serious concerns in Swansea in regard to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I say grateful to all leaders. I think there was a letter sent yesterday to Welsh Government on behalf of the region and as chair of the Pembrokeshire National Coast as well, outlining the concerns and expresses in numbers really the impact, both in terms of risk to housing and affordable housing, and of course the jobs are linked to a lot of the region developments as well. So grateful to everybody for their work on that across the region over the past few days. And I think it's important that we get to grips with that now as part of that task force over the next few weeks. Madeline?
Yeah, just to add to that, Darren, of course, you know, it's an immediate issue facing us all, and some, you know, John has got problems with getting an LDP through and so on. You know, it really is. But I think we all need to consider the much longer term issue that we've got European, you know, national sites, SACs, marine SACs that are failing, and we've got to address that. And I think we can hopefully turn that into the positive as well. Andrea, you know, training people up, it's skills, improving the education and training about what could be done. the issue is we haven't got that guidance at the moment. You know, the mitigation and the opportunities that are there. There will be, and there are, but that's the other area that we need to be thinking about in this longer term. The concern is that, you know, what we are doing to our environment is clearly at the moment coming back to bite us, as we know, with TAN 15 and so on and so forth. So we need to change that mindset now. Hence the concentration on clean energy, which is, you know, clearly such an important area for us.
Yeah, no, points well made, Barra. I think everybody would be in agreement in terms of those underlying principles, isn't it? I suppose it's around how we actually develop and implement changes is the key thing, and the timeliness of information sharing and whatnot is vital. Maybe that's where we've not quite got it right in this instance. Okay, right. If there aren't any further questions, then obviously this is a work in progress. The subcommittee in terms of energy and economy clearly will have a focus on this moving forward, picking up on a lot of the points that we've discussed this morning, including Paul's points in terms of the identifying those gaps in further detail and the links to the regional skills partnership. And we'll no doubt return to this in due course. So thank you, Ross, a diolch i ti, Helen, am gyflwyno. Felly mae'r argymhelliad, os nag oes agor y gwestiynau, mae'r argymhelliad ar gyfer y penderfyniad yma ar dudalen 15 o'r pecyn bore yma. Felly, gai ofyn i rhywun i gynnig os ydych chi'n hapus i dderbyn yr argymhelliad yna. John yn hapus i gynnig, diolch yn fawr. A gai ofyn am eilydd, swch yna. Diolch, Steve. Diolch yn fawr. A felly, os gall, dim ond aelodau'r cyngor sy'n bleisio ar y pwynt yma, felly os gall bawb cwrdd llaw os ydych chi'n hapus i dderbyn yn ffurfiol. Pawb o blaid. Gret. Diolch yn fawr. Felly mae hynny wedi i gymeradwyo. Diolch yn fawr i chi. Newn ni symud ymlaen at eitem 5, sef y ffurflen flynyddol ar gyfer y cydbwyllgor. Eto mae'r adroddiad yma'n dechrau ar dudalen 89 a gai ofyn i Chris Moore i gyflwyno'r adroddiad y siwrch yna. Diolch i ti, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to everyone. Yeah, this is the annual return for last year. It's actually brought to the CJC for information purposes as opposed to approval, because you've delegated as part of your terms of reference the responsibility for approving the accounts to the Governance and Audit Committee, which they've already done last week. So this is just to keep you informed, really, as to where we are with the accounts. So the accounts have been signed off have been completed, signed off by internal audit, and then overviewed and signed off by the Auditor General. They are only a return because if the turnover of an organisation is less than 2.5 million, there is no requirement to do a full statement of accounts, and you can do an annual return, which is a simpler, more straightforward approach. So the actual information here, which is important really for informing CJC, is actually attached on Appendix A, which summarises the cash in and outs during the year and what we spent. You will recall originally we set a budget of 615,000, and that was uplifted during the year by an additional grant that came in respect of the transport funding from Welsh Government to 715. At the time, we set the levy at a similar levy to the previous year, and the uplift in terms of costs was accommodated or planned to be accommodated from the reserves by a downward movement in the reserves of 59,000. During the year, as it happens, the areas like the democratic services, the sports services, etc., spent sort of in line with what was expected. There are some variances. If you go down the page on Appendix A, on page 94, you'll see there's a slight underspend with the joint committee function and the governance function of 44,000. But I think where the bigger underspend was in terms of the work streams, in terms of moving the work streams forward, and as much as there's been a lot of work done as the work streams, they haven't called on money as yet, but that is changing this year, and there is a significantly greater call this year. But it was something that we recognised when we were setting the budget for the current year, and hence why we used some of the reserves, and we put a policy in place to reduce the reserves over the next 3 years to keep the levy down as part of the functioning going forward, because we hadn't particularly spent last year. There has been, to some extent, with some of the work streams, consciousness of clarifying Welsh Government input to some of the funding going forward before some of the commitment in terms of substantial work around some of the work streams. And you will recall originally that we went to do a balanced approach to the work stream work as opposed to a gold standard, because the cost of anything we were going to do was going to fall back on the authorities, and the authorities didn't have the scope within their budgets to undertake that. So in the year, effectively, against the 715,000 that I mentioned, we spent 378,000, and that was, well, the whole cost of that was funded via the grant from Welsh Government, the interest and the levies that we implemented against or called against the four regional or constituent authorities. So the end position was a variance on the year of 391,000, which meant 32,000 went into balances and has been carried forward to next year. That will be used, and that was part of the planning of the budget for current year in terms of utilisation. And I believe we decided to use about 50% of those balances over a 3-year period to hold the levy down, but to advance CJC over the period of the 3 years going forward. So very much the information is there, but very much we were aware of that when we set the budget, and we used that into the following years. So the following pages within the actual document is the physical annual return, which has summarised what I've just gone through in Appendix A, and then the comments coming from Matt Holder as being the internal auditor, who is the lead representative from Pembrokeshire, and then the Auditor General's opinion. Now, neither of those have been signed according to this document, but that was when they were dispatched to you. I can confirm that they have all been signed, and the Auditor General has signed off the year since this was submitted to Democratic Services. They had to wait for the Governance and Audit Committee, which was run last week, which approved the items, and the Chair signed off the papers in that meeting. So hopefully that gives you an overview of the financials for last year. Happy to take any questions. Diolch, Chair.
Right, diolch, Chris, thanks for that. Are there any comments or queries? It seems pretty straightforward, isn't it? Yep, and I think we're all aware of the discussions in terms of the reserve, and clearly that will come into play now for the next few months when we look to set the funding requirement for the next financial year. So if there aren't any questions, it is for noting, as Chris said, the Governance and Audit Committee have signed off on this, so it's for information. So if there aren't any questions, could I ask leaders just to show by raising your hands, and if you're happy to note the report. Pawb o blaid? Great, diolch yn fawr. Wonderful, thank you very much. So item nesaf te, item 6, sef monitro ariannol cwarterol, a mae hwn yn dechrau ar dudalen 101, ac unwaith eto gai ofyn i Chris Moore i gyflwyno'r adroddiad. Diolch i ti, Chris.
Chair, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask Stephen Aldridge-Jones to present on my behalf on this one. Diolch.
No problem. Steve?
Yep, thank you, Jay. Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to start by drawing your attention to Appendix A on page 105. So as you're aware, on 21st of January this year, the Joint Committee approved a 25-26 budget, which was set at 710,000 with a levy from the constituent authorities. And then this was reduced through the utilisation reserves, thus leaving 556,000 to raise through the levy. So as Chris has already mentioned, at that same meeting, it was agreed that the reserves of the CJC would be used to maintain the level of the levy for the current and the future 2 years. So for Q1, the outturn for Q1, we are projecting a total underspend of 345,000, and then with this balance being transferred to the CJC reserve at year end. So I'll quickly run through some of the variances in the appendix. You can see the support services, we are projecting an underspend of almost 50,000. This is due to the budgeted senior accountant post remaining vacant given the current workload of the CJC. It's not currently being required. Moving slightly down to the subcommittee, sorry. The level of activities is increasing this year, and we are forecasting an overspend of 117,000. But you'll notice this is in part due to the £200,000 Welsh Government grant expenditure on the RTP, but we do get this income, and it's further down on the appendix. Of the 108,000 planning and management line within the subcommittee's subsection, we're expecting costs of 35,000. This is for the planning officer to develop the STP, resulting in an underspend in this line of 74,000. There's a regional investment strategy being procured at a cost of 75,000. 40,000 which will be funded through the Economic Development Subcommittee budget, with the remaining 35,000 to be vied from the Consultancy and Specialist Advisor budget within the Regional Management Office below, which then leads me on to the Regional Management Office section below. You can see here there's an overspend of almost 37,000. This is in part due to we expect in the appointment of Chief Operating Officer to start in January 26, and this will cost roughly 35,000 until the end of the financial year. We're also expecting additional costs of 30,000 for the UK Reef event, and as I've noted previously, 35,000 for the Consultancy and Specialist Advisor budget line, which will be vied up to the Economic Development Subcommittee. And then moving down to the income, as I've mentioned already, we have an additional £200,000 from the Welsh Government to support the finalisation or the completion of the Regional Transport Plan. We also expect an additional 200,000 to support the development of capacity and governance arrangements within the CJC. And then finally, we're roughly estimating £50,000 worth of interest to be earned on reserve in the year, which then moves on to the bottom of the appendix. So we incorporate the brought forward balance from the previous year. As Chris mentioned, this is 1.17 million. Building in the underspend for this year gives us roughly 1.4 million at the year end. So thank you very much, Chair. I'm open for any questions if needed.
Thanks, Steve. Chris?
Just two further comments. Obviously, Steve did mention the Chief Operating Officer, obviously on the year now, which will be next year. That's going to make a significant difference because it's quite a substantial salary. So that will change an element of profile here. And what's the other thing I think members should recognise is when we set this budget, we had no knowledge of some of these additional grants now that Welsh Government, through the lobbying, Welsh Government are coming forward with. So we will have to look at rebalancing some of that as we go into next year. All positive because Welsh Government are recognising that they need to support CJCs, but that was not something we informed of or we had the information at the time of setting the budget.
You know, absolutely. On that point, I know that one of the areas was around the RTP and the funding that was coming our way. There was initial suggestion of Welsh Government around the 200,000, which you referenced today, Steve, but I think there was some uncertainty at one point, and we raised this with the Minister a few weeks ago in a meeting with Swansea, where they indicated that might only be £100,000. But what you're saying is we have had confirmation that it is at the 200,000 level for this financial year, have we? We've had that in writing now, in terms of the Regional Transport Plan support?
I believe we have. Is that right, Christy? Sorry, unless we've heard anything different.
Good morning, Chair. Just to confirm that we've had the grants as stated by Stephen in correspondence from Welsh Government, both in March and in July this year. So it is documented, and we are having a follow-up discussion through the Pan Wales CJC group as well. So again, I'll be seeking clarification on receipt of those grants as promised, really.
Yeah, that's
Thank
great.
you.
That's good news. Because obviously there are staffing implications linked to that, isn't there? Because we're starting to utilise some of that funding. So it's good news that we've got that confirmed, because I know there was some uncertainty at one stage. Okay, great.
Sorry, Darren, just on that, I think the other thing that we'll have to consider going forward and through further dialogue is the longevity of some of these grants, because I know that one has been put in for 3 years, but the others are where we're following up on an annual basis. Well, if we're building them into the base budget going forward and continuing doing work, it's something that we're going to have further discussions, I suspect, with the Welsh Government on.
Ie. Na ni. Reit, diolch yn fawr. Reit, os na unrhyw sylwadau neu unrhyw gwestiynau pellach, os na eto gwybodaeth o'r adroddiad, felly gael ofyn i'r arweinwyr os i godi'ch llaw o'ch chi'n hapus i dderbyn yn ffurfiol. Pawb yn hapus o blaid? Ne, diolch yn fawr. Hynny wedi dderbyn. Felly, newn ni symud ymlaen at eitem 7, sef y blaen rhaglen waith. Mae hwnna'r gwybodaeth ar dudalen 107. Os yna unrhyw beth, mae rhywun am ychwanegu neu am godi clywed, is there anything to raise from your perspective? It seems pretty straightforward.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just wanted to raise that we do have the interviews, the shortlisting and interviews for the Chief Operating Officer to add to this list. So I can confirm that the invitations have been sent out and the shortlisting is taking place on Friday the 17th of October and the interviews will be the Tuesday the 18th of November. So just to bear those in mind as well. And in terms of the regional transport plan, I know there's been discussions ongoing about when the delivery is going to be presented to CJC, and we are looking at organising that for the morning of the 18th of November, which is the day of the interviews. We're going to hold a short session to start with for that and then go into the interviews once that is concluded. So just giving you that update, Chair. And obviously if there's any other reports that need to be added to future meetings, please just let myself or Christy know.
There we are, great stuff. Thanks very much, Chloe. Yeah, good to hear that the recruitment process is proceeding as planned, and we look forward to that appointment, of course. Great, thank you for that. So, os ych chi'n hapus there, that's just for information. Item 8 is agenda items, none have been brought to my attention, and so with that we can conclude the meeting. And thank you all for your presence and your contributions. Diolch yn fawr chi gyd. We hope you have a nice day.